Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rebecca Gonzalez. I am the head of enablement for the Generative AI Innovation Center at AWS. Thank you for joining us here at reInvent 2023. It's so good to have you. Having a session on Thursday is always a gamble. So sometimes you're talking to yourself. So we're very excited that you're here for this amazing conversation with Dr. Margaret Mitchell. So I've asked her to stay seated while I get to talk about her for 5 or 6, maybe 10 minutes. There's a long list of things that we're going to talk about with Dr. Mitchell. So let's begin. So Dr. Margaret Mitchell is a researcher focused on machine learning and ethics-informed AI development. She has published around 100 papers on natural language generation, assistive technology, computer vision, AI ethics, and she also holds multiple patents. She currently works at Hugging Face as the chief ethics scientist, driving forward ML development, ecosystem ML data governance, AI evaluation, and AI ethics. She previously worked at Google AI as a staff research scientist, where she founded Google's ethical AI group, focused on foundational AI, ethics, research, and operationalizing AI ethics. Before joining Google, she was a researcher at Microsoft, focused on computer vision to language generation, and was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins. She also has a PhD in science from the University of Aberdeen and a master's in computational linguistics from the University of Washington. And if that wasn't enough, her TED Talk, How We Can Build AI to Help Humans, Not Hurt Them, has over 1.3 million views. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. And let's add on, Dr. Mitchell. She has recently been named Time's 100 Most Influential People for 2023. So I'm pretty sure that she's best friends with everyone on that list, so I personally am going to ask for an introduction to Beyoncé. But that's just me. So please join me, reInvent 2023, in welcoming Dr. Margaret Mitchell to her first reInvent talk.
That was too kind. Thank you.
All right. So there's been lots of news lately. I'm sure a couple of you may have heard a story or two. On your Time's Most Influential People list, there's different sections. You were named a pioneer, along with Doja Cat as well, so I found that very interesting.
We're BFFs.
I figured. But someone else notable that was in the pioneers list was Sam Altman from OpenAI. So that's something that you share. So what I want to start with is, based on the news that's just happened recently and all of the, let's call it a situation with OpenAI, how do you feel like this current environment that we're living in, how do you feel that that's going to impact your work and the work other people are doing on responsible and ethical AI?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important conversation to have because there are lessons that can be learned from this. So when you're working on operationalizing ethical AI, one thing you have to grapple with is different values. People come to the table with different sorts of priorities, and you can go even further with that within a company by saying we embrace this at the highest levels. We have some people who are going to focus on these kinds of values. We're going to have others who are focusing on these kind of values. And so what I saw sort of unfolding with OpenAI, I've heard lots of negative words to describe it. Event.
Yes. It's a good one.
Yeah. Was a value conflict, where on the one hand, it seemed that you had board members who were deeply ingrained in the AI safety world, thinking about the long-term, existential risk and these kinds of things that have to do with foresight about AI. And you have Sam Altman, who was hired to focus on commercialization, right? And sometimes these values can be in conflict. And so while we still don't know exactly what happened, my higher level understanding from working on values and operationalization is that there was likely one set of values that the board had been entrusted with, from my understanding. Sam had said publicly that they have the power to fire me, which I understood to be in the case of value conflict. And then you had, Sam on the other side doing his job as well. And so I think that the idea of this board was a bit of an experiment, right? Like, OpenAI was like, okay, we're going to have a capped profit model. We're going to have part of ourselves be nonprofit, part of ourselves be profit. There's this board that oversees it all. And like everything in science, you sort of try something, you make mistakes, you iterate, you learn by doing. And so that's my impression of this whole thing, is that it was a little bit of an experiment about having the board in this position. There were two groups there, sort of Sam and the board, who were entrusted with different kinds of values, and there was a value conflict. And so I think, moving forward, there should be things like respect towards the company that's providing you with your compute, for example. And so I wasn't surprised when I heard that Satya was going to, or Microsoft was going to play a role as an observer. That struck me as sort of scientifically, as you're iterating on ideas, the next place for it to go. So how do you bridge commercialization and safety and that sort of thing? So at least let them have part of the discussion. So I really think it's a learning moment. I don't want it to be seen as, something horrible that we need to move on from. I think it really shows you the power of value conflict, what can happen, and the fact that we need to grapple with this when we're trying to trade off different benefits and different, risks of AI.
Yeah. When I was on the responsible AI team in ProServe here at AWS, we put together 7 pillars of a responsible AI framework, very similar to what you'll see from the OECD and things like that. But what we always focused on, and this is what struck me as interesting, whenever I spoke to a company for the first time, we would start with value alignment. And that was at the top of our pyramid, basically, that said, if you are not using your AI in the way that aligns with your organizational values, you are never going to be successful. So I feel like this is at maybe at a macro level, kind of what we see playing out in front of us.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe, with this experimental structure, they hadn't fully figured out how to do the value alignment thing. And maybe, part of what we learn from this is more about how to even do that. Right? It's like a learning experience, and it's a challenge.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. So I talked about your multiple degrees, your background, how did you get here? When was there a moment in your studies that you decided that this is where you were going to spend your time? How did you decide to make this your focus on the data ethics and of science, really?
Right, yeah. So I guess there were two moments maybe worth noting. So one moment was when I was an undergraduate. I was pursuing a linguistics major, and on the side, I was very much self-taught for programming. I took programming classes in high school, but even before that in middle school, I had been programming and stuff. And so I was telling my mom on the phone in undergrad, okay, I decided I'm going to major in linguistics. And she was like, okay, how are you going to make money with that?
Gosh, I don't think any of us have ever heard that from our parents.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I was like, okay, Mom, I have an idea. I'm going to combine language and computers. It's going to be like a whole thing where I program and there's language. And she was like, okay, good luck, And then I found out that that's actually a field called natural language processing with a lot of great people. And so that was how I sort of went into my path for natural language processing. Which is a subset of machine learning, and machine learning is a subset of AI, so just to make sure everyone's on the same page there. When I went to ethics, there was a very specific moment for me. I was working at Microsoft Research on vision to language, so translating sequences of images to natural language descriptions. This was at a time when natural language generation was really not a thing. I was part of a very small group of people doing this. And deep learning had just started to show itself as something very promising. So those of us who were really interested in language generation were like, okay, how can we put these things together? How can we take deep learning and make language generation? So I was working on a system that generated descriptions of sequences to make a kind of story. And I gave this system a sequence where there was sort of a view from the third story of an apartment overlooking a massive explosion. And it turned out it was an explosion at an oil factory. There was fire, or at least sort of the colors of fire, purples and pinks in the sky. It was very intense. And my system looked at it and said, "This is awesome! What a great view! This is beautiful." And
wow.
My heart stopped, because in that moment, I realized the disconnect between the kinds of data we're showing the system and, human life, So I realized that it had seen lots of pictures of sunsets. And people upload tons of pictures in sunset and say they're awesome and say they're beautiful, right? No one is ever like, this is a crappy sunset. So it was seeing these purples and pinks, and it had learned, this means awesome, this is beauty.
Yeah.
And so I was immediately struck by existential risk and harm because of this disconnect, and I was struck by data bias, right, because of what was being represented in the data. So this put me down a path where I started deeply focusing on data and the relationship between inputs and outputs, and what kinds of things do we need to do in order to make sure that we have systems that are, well aligned with human values.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's great. So you've had multiple roles in multiple companies, and I can tell you the way I kind of came to your work was, just by reading and studying, and I was doing my due diligence on LLMs, and responsible AI is something that I have as part of my job, and I'm doing research on LLMs, and I read a Stanford article. And the Stanford article was back in June, and I don't know if any of you saw it here. If you haven't, I highly recommend you take a look. So Stanford took I think it was about 10, 15 of the LLMs. Now, this is in June, so we have had multiple iterations since, so this is just a piece of data. They listed all of the foundation models out, and they compared them to the proposed legislation that's coming out about the EU AI Act. There's lots, I think there's multiple legislations that will be coming out throughout the next couple of years around AI, and now with generative AI, everything seems to be speeding up. So I'm looking across, there is a 48-point scale, and most of the LLMs that they're looking at from companies that have 3 points, have 7 points. So this is out of 48 points, and those are very low scores. So there was one model that had, I think it was 35 or 36. So good, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but no, we can strive, but not ever reach perfection usually. And I said, wow, Hugging Face is doing really great. That is the highest score by far from this, and this is proposed legislation. And I started to talk to some of my science friends at the Innovation Center, and I said, hey, who do we know over at Hugging Face? I really want to have a chat to see what they're doing to have so much higher scores than their cohort, right? And one of my dear friends in Europe had met you and said, oh, it's Margaret Mitchell. And I was like, oh, Margaret Mitchell's there. This now makes sense. Yeah. So can we thank you for doing that? Is this the Margaret Mitchell effect for Hugging Face?
It was a group effort. There were so many people. So this was part of a massive, actually, international collaboration. And there were a few people there who were focusing on things like ethics. So Yassine Jernit, my colleague, was actually who recruited me, really pushing that forward. Giada Pistilli, who's actually an ethicist, like she has a PhD in ethics, which you hardly ever find in tech, amongst tech ethicists. And Our approach was definitely informed by where we thought legislation would be going, but I think that when there isn't clear law, but you're doing something that's going to affect people's lives, that's where ethics can really shine. Because it helps you work through what are the best things to do in light of society. The law can't tell us, it's not there yet. Right. So we look to ethics. And so what we ended up doing, similar to what you were saying about alignment for values, we brought folks together and we worked through what are your values, right? So we were sort of recognizing that everyone comes to the table with their own sets of values. It's not a tabula rasa where you can sort of start from scratch, and also this was a new effort. So we were talking through with everyone, where do we all align on our values, and can we put these together into an ethical charter that then influences all of the decisions we make from there. So that's what we did. It was actually really fun to do. We did consensus building, which is where you're trying to minimize the strongest disagreements. Okay. So even if there's one person who's like, this makes no sense to me, I find it insulting, whatever it is, their voice matters, right? If it is a strong objection, that is important to take into account. And so we use this consensus building to build the ethical charter. And then from there, all the things we did were in light of the values we had defined for the ethical charter. So I can give an example of one place where there was a lot of conflict. I mean, it was a surprise to me that I should say that Stanford's results came out that way. But it was really nice to know that a grounding in ethics and sort of foresight about how these things might play out in society was aligning with regulation. That sort of made me feel heartened about regulation.
Absolutely.
But one area I think that sheds light on part of the difficulty here was around privacy and PII redaction. And this was an area where the charter didn't end up telling us the right answer. Instead, we had to work through consensus. Okay. So there was a section of us who were saying, you have to advance PII detection. In the US, it's called PII, personally identifiable information. Right. It's called different things in other countries, but I'll just say PII. We have to advance the state of the art in PII because it doesn't work that well. Then we have to apply it to everything. Redact names, redact email addresses, redact aliases, all these things, and then we can train the model. There was another section of people who were like, that is not the state of the art, right? We can't advance PII detection as part of this work because that's not what other companies are doing, and we're trying to do the state of the art. We're trying to replicate the state of the art openly. Right. So if we want to do that, we can't do all this fancy PII stuff.
Interesting.
And so we ended up getting to a point where we agreed we can redact email addresses and aliases, which are the easiest to redact, I'll say. It's super easy, regular expression, they behave regularly, it's an easy thing to do. We won't redact things that could be addresses because they can get confused with math. And part of the state of the art with foundation models, language models, is being able to do math. Okay. The true positive, or the false positives for math was too high. Gotcha. So we had this kind of meeting of the minds where one group felt very strongly about privacy, another group felt very strongly about reproducibility. And so we ended up coming to this sort of agreement where it's not perfect for privacy, it's not maybe perfect for reproducibility, because now we're finding that email addresses and stuff are actually in these models. Right. But it was a little bit of a harmonization of the sort of different values at play.
Yeah, so let's dig a little bit deeper into how you do that. So one of the things that was very important to me, and we'll get into it, I really want you to walk out of here with some very practical knowledge, even if most of you are not going to build an LLM, right? Most of you are not going to build a foundation model, right? You're going to use what is being created for you. So I would love for you to walk out with that, and we'll get to that in a second, I promise. But so in my head, you are this think tank, this mind meld of science and ethics, and
Oh, and personally, I think
No, just like you and your team. I feel
okay.
like you're just you're this perfect little utopia of the creation of technology, but balancing it with these risks and harms. So how do you get there? What does a day with your team look like? Like, how do you guys work together? What does it look like to be on your team or in your team at Hugging Face?
Right. So I think one thing that's really important is to make these ethical discussions open to everyone, to not silo it in one part of the company, and to sort of, companies can be vertically organized in terms of organizations. They can also be horizontally organized in terms of interests and skill sets. So our approach has really been horizontal, where we have a meeting every week that anyone in the company can come to. It's at rotating times for time zone inclusion. And people can put stuff on the agenda to talk about ethical issues that are concerning to them. Sometimes we gossip about the news. We're trying to make it a fun place as well. But basically open to everyone to come and talk about things and start to understand the vocabulary you can use to navigate ethical issues. Because once you have the vocabulary, the lexicon, you start to be able to see it a little bit more too, understand, oh, this is this issue, this is that issue, And so we work with everyone across the company on building up the sort of lexicon, understanding what the various issues and trade-offs are within their own work. And then some of them end up being so passionate about it that they want to do only that full time.
Okay.
And so the company has been flexible in that way, where people who really shine at this are able to sort of come and join us and work with me directly, full time, whatever it is. But it's also important to know that it's not just one team that's siloed. Yeah. We really tried and work on having it horizontally across the company because that's the way to have ethics in every team. If there's one person from every team who deeply cares about ethics, and my experience in tech is that usually that's how it is. Mm-hmm. Usually there's like one or two people who are like, am I the only person that cares about this? So you bring those people together, yes. That was actually part of how the ethics work started at Google, was that some people from one team would talk to me and be like, no one in my team cares about this, and then someone else would have the same issue and be like, no one in my team cares about this. I'm like, you should be friends.
Here, enjoy.
Yeah, exactly. So, the sort of horizontal relationship building, and then people can bring the skills they learn back to the team and then integrate that into the technology that they're developing. Yeah. And so it ends up creating, I think, inclusion, and also a space where people who, within their teams, might have been feeling marginalized, or like maybe they weren't as important, they have now a space where they can shine and a skill set that they can be recognized for.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit about open source versus closed source, right? So Hugging Face you're using open source models. How does that impact your work at all, the open source versus the proprietary models?
Oh, it impacts my work a lot, in part just because it's so much part of the conversation right now. I mean, talking about regulation, there's a lot of concerns about open source and security leaks, this sort of thing. And so what we end up doing is sort of the same thing you do in all ethical discussions, where you align it to the values, and then you talk about the trade-offs, right? So there's the ability for people to protect their privacy. If you have an open source model, you don't have to be calling it through some API that belongs to another customer, right? Or that belongs to another entity. You can have it within your own cluster. You can do on-prem solutions, these kinds of things. So there's these sort of privacy things. There's the security concerns, but that actually ends up being at play in both more closed and more open. We've seen lots of leaking from larger sort of closed situations. So that ends up, if you work through the examples, it's not necessarily clear that open source is more of a security issue. And then there's, a whole bunch of other things like being able to develop for your specific task, sort of curating things, being able to collaborate, pooling resources so you don't have separate entities inventing the same thing at the same time. You can like build from one another and make things that are really amazing and creative.
Right.
And so we talk through this, and we talk to customers about it at Hugging Face. We talk to legislators about it who want to understand more. And really, it comes down to what are your values as an organization, as a customer, and what kinds of solutions best align with those values.
Yeah.
So just, like everything, it's just thinking through the trade-offs. And that's why it's really useful to have the values in place at the start, because you don't have to sort of think of it on the fly. You can say like, oh, this sort of thing is very important to my company, so this kind of model is what I'd like to use.
I love that. So let's start with our first piece of like really tangible advice we can give the audience. So if there's a customer sitting here in front of us that is starting their journey with generative AI, and they are looking for a foundation model that aligns with their ethical position or their values or the values of their company, how would they go about, I'm not asking you to give me specific models, but how would you advise them to go about looking into the models? What should they be looking for?
Yeah.
What questions should they be asking the partners that they're working with? How do they understand, how do they get to the data that will help them make a good decision for them that aligns with their ethics?
Right, yeah. So first thing I would say, having worked at companies that interface with customers, is that the customers have to ask.
Point one, ask.
So, ask like, how does this model take care of this and that? So if you have your own values, it's useful in these conversations to sort of ask how these different models are taking these things into account, because when there's not demand, there's not necessarily the supply. So I would love for large foundation model releases to be accompanied with detailed documentation that helps you easily see values. And I've worked on a framework called Model Cards that does this in part and is being actually, recently in the EU AI Act, they're starting to say, oh, this is what we need.
Oh, wow.
So it might become a thing where you can easily see the values for different models. But until there is, I think, a requirement of documentation, you have to ask, And so different companies have put forward different kinds of different versions of model cards. So some of them are system cards because it's a larger system. Some of them just like fill out a little bit of the information. But you can extrapolate things from that, right? So you know that OpenAI cares a lot about safety. They put out all this red teaming detail about their models. We see that a lot of people using Hugging Face models are really interested in, well, really the state of the art, how well do these different models compare along all these different kinds of benchmarks, that sort of thing. I guess that would be values around like high accuracy or high performance on different benchmarks. That ends up being the kind of value you want to have. So as much as you can, look into the documentation to extract the values. And if the documentation isn't there, ask,
That's great. I love that. And do you feel like it's easier to have this conversation with an open source company versus a proprietary company? Is that what you're seeing?
Right. So in this question, am I on the, so I've worked both in a closed and open. So which side am I on? Am I talking to open versus closed companies, or am I someone within an open?
You're talking to them.
Talking to them, okay.
So imagine yourself as a customer.
Okay. Oh, wait.
So do you find that, if you were a customer, are the conversations with an open source or proprietary company harder, different? You've worked on both sides. How do you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's gonna, I think, be more straightforward with open companies. I think there are definitely sort of pitfalls in both where they're not gonna know the answer. So maybe the answer will be like, I'll have to get back to you, or maybe it'll just be it's proprietary because it's like, I actually don't know.
Right.
And that's gonna, I bet happen across the board. But part of being open source is open transparency.
Right.
So there's a risk there to the company, to some extent, having ideas stolen, this sort of thing. But that also means I think it's easier for customers to get down into the weeds. I mean, that's part of the idea with open source. Yeah.
So do you think that it is inherently harder to build responsibly, or is it not?
I don't think it's harder to build responsibly, all else equal. The difficulty is really within top-down support. And you basically, if you want to do responsible AI type stuff, ideally you would have support all the way up to the level of the CEO. Right. Because culture flows top-down, priorities, of course, flow top-down. So if you don't have a CEO saying, this is important to me, then if you work on it, you're not going to be promoted, you're not going to have as much influence on the company, that sort of thing, or your ideas won't be, implemented at all. And so there are lots of ways to develop machine learning. There's lots of ways to develop AI. I think the responsible AI approach, where you establish values and sort of align to those, actually ends up being a bit more scientific than some of the state-of-the-art right now, because it's a sort of very intentional approach. Which can mean higher quality models that are more aligned to specific use cases, that sort of thing. So I think in the long term, it's actually useful and a relatively straightforward thing to do. But you have to have the company support. Yeah. That the cultural issue is really the barrier. Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So perfect segue into my next question.
Okay.
Let's talk about use cases.
Okay.
Right? I think of the people that I've spoken to, we have customers all along the path. Some are just starting to think about use cases. Some are already in the process of experimenting. Then it gets smaller on the implementation, and then it gets smaller on the actual having use cases live in their infrastructure. So let's talk about what use cases you've seen in your work. Are there any great use cases for generative AI? Yeah. And then are there some bad use cases for generative AI? Let's talk some use cases.
Yeah, so I love creative uses of generative AI. I think one of the things to know about the current state of the art with language models that are used generatively and image models is that they're not grounded on a knowledge base or something factual. So they're great for things that don't require facts. Okay. Fiction, story writing, coming up with characters, this kind of thing. I love using language models as a language learning tool. Oh, yeah. So some of the use cases I see is within schools. People are interested in, if we have English as, a non-native language speakers coming in, can they work with these models in order to understand the language? And yes, absolutely, have conversations with them. I think this is great. It's only when you start to sort of say that this works for facts in all cases that gets a little outside of where the state of the art is. Okay. So I love the creative uses. I love the ability to iterate in order to stimulate your own thinking and that kind of thing. So anything that's working as a sort of an assistive device, helping artists quickly, give examples of the kind of things they might do, helping people write stories, write fiction, helping language learners, or English language learners. Oh, I should say because these tend to work well in English.
That was going to be my next question.
Other languages, not as much. But English, it's useful for learning English. Those kinds of things. I love those use cases. I think those are great.
Great. Yeah. So what are some maybe not so ideal use cases? You hinted a little bit to the factual side of the world.
Yeah, so I'm really concerned that people are getting it confused with search. The thing to know, and that's not to say it can't, Correct. Generative AI can't be that way at some point, maybe even some point soon. It's just not there yet. Correct. How it is optimized is to be a plausible sentence generator. You combine that with automation bias, which is the tendency to believe things coming out of automated systems, and you have misinformation. You have things that are not correct and look very real, and then people believe it, right? And that's terrible in terms of general society understanding. So on the one hand, having conversations to try and work through maybe what you want, that's one thing. But using it as a replacement for search, you're gonna get wrong answers and you're not gonna know what's right and what's wrong. And that is super concerning to me because people are using it that way.
Yeah, exactly. How are you using it in your daily life right now?
I'm mostly, So I read papers that expose various things, and then I try and replicate it. So I'm actually using it more from a replication standpoint. So like, what are other people doing? I'll do that. I think more, I'm just sort of studying to see how things pan out. And then I've also worked on tools, for example, to demonstrate bias. So if anyone's going to NeurIPS, we're presenting a paper on this about seeing the different kind of biases in image diffusion models. So it can be helpful to visualize what's been learned under the hood, and understand how these sort of biases play out. So yeah, I'm actually not really using it for fun stuff.
You're a little bit busy.
I'm a little jealous of people who are doing fun and creative stuff because, yeah, I definitely see the appeal. But yeah, I'm definitely looking at it more from like a scientific perspective, like, oh, humans interacting with these systems, what are they looking for?
That's kind of your job. I get it. I get it. I'm just trying to get it to make my PowerPoints because
there you go.
That's what I'm starting. As soon as reInvent's over, because it's kind of been a big thing to get ready for this. As soon as reInvent's over, I'm going to try to get all my PowerPoints created because that takes way too much of my time.
Creative usage of images, yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. That's awesome. Okay, so I just realized I left the clicker over here, and I wanted to start talking about best practices. So let me get my clicker. So this is something that we've worked on internally here at AWS to really we're talking about evolving best practices, right? Because I think we all know the models that we're using today to do the things that we're using are not the models that we're going to use tomorrow, right? So these best practices for building responsibly are something that we're working on a lot. One of the things that we have found in our work is a lot of our customers, which are, of course, large enterprises, they're using these on internal use cases first, which I love, because this is the way we minimize the impact of the models, is by testing them on our own data, testing them ourselves. So here's some 6 that we have, right? So we start, this is my favorite one, define the use case, the more specific and narrow, the better.
Love that.
So just be very specific, something that you can prove the ROI from that will not impact your systems to a point where to their detriment.
Yep, got to know the context.
Exactly.
The context of use.
Yes, absolutely. The second one is to prioritize education and diversity in your workforce, right? And I think I can speak a little bit to that. This is something that I'm super passionate about, but it's not only about diversity of women versus men. It's diversity of where you grew up, what your socioeconomic status was, what part of the world you grew up in. You know, it's
different life experiences.
Yes, absolutely. And bringing people with different lived experiences to the table is also super important to me because I don't see the same problems that you do.
Exactly.
You won't see the same problems that we do, right? We all have a different
Or the same
view.
opportunities for that matter.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And things are going to be different for each of us. So, and then the education, I find that and I wonder if you see this as well, there's a lot of fear right now about what is going to happen or what could happen if left unchecked, right? So really educating ourselves and becoming educated consumers, right? It always stuck with me in my studies that the people creating these models only represents a small portion of the population, while the entire population is affected by these models. So really educating yourself as a consumer as well and deciding what is acceptable use for you and your data. I know no one's going to read the entire new updates from Apple when they tell us what we have to agree to, right? You're not going to read your whole agreement. You're going to click accept because you want to play Angry Birds. So, you know, we want to make sure that we educate ourselves. Assessing the risk with performance evaluation. One of the things we talk about, this is not a set and forget type of technology, right? It's going to be learning, it's going to be giving you different outcomes, you're going to be prompting it to do different things. So evaluate it. Is it doing the right things and what you want? Testing, obviously, very important. Continually iterate across the life cycle. And then we talked a little bit about this, introducing these governance policies, accountability, and measurements early and often, because just like responsible AI, you can't bolt that onto the system after it's done. So that's kind of how we look at it. Again, evolving best practices.
Love it.
What do you think is there anything that you think is missing, or what would you add, or what? I'd love to get your just perspective on best practices.
So the first one, I would add, or I would have a parallel to that of defining users.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So I actually end up operationalizing this as a bit of a 2x2 matrix where you have intended users and unintended users, and you have intended use cases and unintended use cases.
I love that.
And then you work through the different scenarios, what can go right, what can go wrong, and make sure that you're hitting on the intended uses, and the negative, malicious uses, these kinds of things are minimized as much as possible.
That's amazing, yeah.
So the matrix kind of framing helps. And when I say users, I should make clear that there are the direct users and there's also those affected. So there's two different populations here to keep in mind, right? So like if you have face recognition used on you, you're someone who's affected, but you're not a direct user. You're not the person deploying that, right? Yeah. So it's important to keep in mind that there are these two populations at play.
The impact versus the deployed.
Yeah. So I call them users and those affected. Not very catchy. I don't think anyone in the responsible AI space has thought of a catchier. I don't know.
We'll work on that.
But yeah, so for the first one, I have the parallel for users, and I do the sort of matrix thing. I think that one thing I might add with respect to risk and testing is disaggregated evaluation. Okay. So this is sort of implicit, but I might even, maybe I wouldn't pull it out directly, but I think it's important for people to know that if you're trying to look at, for example, bias across different subpopulations, you have to disaggregate the evaluation across the subpopulations, right? How well does it work for black women versus white men? And what is that difference? That difference is a type of bias. And when you do this sort of stratified evaluation across different users, across different use cases, right? Now you see where your models work very, very well, where they could be deployed and where they don't. So this sort of disaggregated evaluation instead of these aggregate numbers that people tend to look at are super important to do. Okay. I love the continually iterate across the AI lifecycle. I'm assuming that within that includes deployment.
Yes.
Right, so you're monitoring as it's deployed, you're maybe getting feedback from people, and then updating and changing things in light of feedback. I think that's a really important thing to do. I love the focus on measurement. Measurement has recently become a passion of mine, right? You can't improve what you can't measure. And I would love measurement to be applied to data with the same rigor that evaluation is applied to models. So like as evaluate is to model, measure is to data. And so I might add into this maybe something about quantifying something about the data. Although if you're a customer, you don't have access to that. So I guess it a little bit depends on if you're internal.
Or external, yeah.
If I was to add one more thing, it might be document.
Oh, okay.
Right, so if you want to reflect on the decisions that have been made, then it's really useful to have documentation, a sort of paper trail of what has happened until then. It's also really useful for launch decisions if you're trying to launch responsibly. So like, what data work did the people do? The data people do? What evaluation work did the evaluation people do? Have we covered our bases in a way where we can put this out, with our brand on it and feel that this is responsible, that this is okay? So it's really important to have sort of documentation throughout the process to help with reflecting, to help with building off of things, to help with noticing if something has been missed, or adding additional kinds of things that need to be done. And of course, it's useful for learning later. It's really common in the tech industry to do postmortems, and sometimes that's the first time that decisions get documented. Fair enough. So it's ideal to sort of have them beforehand, and then you can kind of point to it. Oh, this is something that we need to improve. So documentation, I would say, just like you have test, I might have document, although that does not sound as, I'm not good at catchy phrases, as you can probably tell. But maybe adding something about documentation too would be good.
That's great. And what I love about what's happening right now is AI as it exists today, or the first time we talked about AI in society, I think was in the 1950s, right? And we didn't really start having these conversations about responsibility and governance for AI until maybe 5 years ago, maybe? I mean, I might be overshooting it. Maybe it was 3 years ago, right, that we started having these conversations.
It depends on the circles.
Depends on the circles, correct.
Yeah.
But now with with generative AI, these things were exposed so much earlier, in my opinion, that we started talking about the responsibility and the governance right from the get-go. I saw a change in the way we were talking about things, and I saw the way that customers were coming to us, that they are very cognizant of the impacts that these models can have, and everyone is keeping it front of mind, and that makes me feel better about that and about the future.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Okay, so let's see where we are. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the way you built your team. I think I can move here. Yeah. So, how did you build your team? When you're looking for a team to support the work, what do you look for? What's important for you in building that team?
I really look for people who are bridges, who are translating people who are good at statistics and good at understanding people, and able to talk to both of those populations. Because part of doing ethical work is understanding the context of use, understanding how people might interact with these systems, but you also have to implement it. So you have to do the coding and this sort of stuff, but then you also have to have this sort of more, I guess, humanities sort of focus as well. So I really look for interdisciplinarity in general in people's backgrounds. I look for even if someone hasn't had study in a bunch of different areas, I look at their communication. How good are they at translating, statistical concepts that might be really tricky unless you're really in the weeds to a program manager or a product manager who might not have that background, right? Because in tech generally, actually it's a little bit different at different companies, but there's often the sort of engineers and then the product manager, where the product manager focuses on whether it should be launched and how people will respond, and the engineers are sort of doing their math and that kind of thing. You need people who can bridge any sort of divide in understanding or any sort of disconnect in understanding in order to really get into what values have been at play and how does this align to what we want our customers to be exposed to. So I look for the communication, I look for the interdisciplinarity. I also look for how well they do at identifying different kinds of values. So they might not have the words for it, they might not have the lexicon. That takes, you can study, you can learn those things. But I look for if they see something that's put forward as really beneficial and great, can you see where there's an issue? Right. If I'm selling something to you as if it's amazing, do you have that, wait a second, what about, you're totally missing this thing, you're trying to pull it feels like the wool's being pulled over my eyes. What about this other thing? So I look at the ability to kind of think outside the box that way and recognize factors that might be being overlooked.
That's great.
And the interesting thing about that, this might not be surprising to you, is that automatically creates diverse teams. All of the teams I've worked with have been majority marginalized characteristics, majority tech minority, right? And it's not because I specifically was I need to hire, someone with these characteristics. It's just because the skill set and the life experiences just ends up lending itself to diverse teams. Right. So you don't even have to worry about the diversity. It just comes automatically.
Wow.
When you're looking at people who can translate amongst different ideas, when you're looking at people who have these, the way of thinking outside the box, that kind of thing. It ends up, I've gotten lots of credit for building diverse teams, and it's sort of that just sort of happened, right?
Wow. That's hashtag goals right there. Because,
right,
obviously, I've been in tech for a long time, and I have very few conversations where people say, and it just happened.
It just happened. It just fell out of it. So
that's amazing.
It's a nice thing.
I love what you just said, because being someone who is not a technologist, I was trained as a journalist, and I've been doing this work for quite some time now. I love the focus on those interdisciplinary skills. Right. It's not enough just to know how to code.
Right.
right? It's not, if you need to bring these skills to the table. So if there was someone here that's, we have a lot of students that come to this organization, that we have a lot of diverse builders that come because of our All Builders Welcome programs, what would you tell them to focus on other than, like, say, if someone's becoming a software design engineer, right? What other things do you think they should include in their education to be successful?
Okay, so outside of the programming
Outside of the
stuff.
programming stuff. Let's assume that that's 10 out of 10, they're done with that.
Yeah, well, it's important to understand society. So work that helps you understand that. So things like social science, journalism is an amazing, you learn how to talk to people and get information from them. That's amazing, you know, and then write about it in a clear way. So paying attention to those areas where it helps you to understand people and their values and communicate about them, those are really key, in my mind, for the sort of larger ethical AI endeavor. You really need to be able to focus on what is this going to say for, you know, what is this going to do for Latinx women? Is that going to be different than it is for, you know, the white men who are stress testing this? And like, how do I do participatory design, right? So that they're actually there. Because in the tech, you know, I mean, you probably know this too. You like look around, you're like, okay, nobody looks like me, right? So you have to get people who can provide this information, have the part of the participation. So you need to have people working with you who have the skills to talk to people from different populations, see what they're thinking, understand how to do these kinds of integrations of different sort of values and different sort of ideas on things. So really the ability to communicate with and understand people, and the different areas where you can do that, I think are critical.
That's amazing. So if you weren't focusing on this right now, if you had taken a different path, what else would you be doing with your life if you had not gone down this path?
Yeah, so there's a part of me that just wants to like live in the woods as a hermit and just, I don't know what, I'm not like a good artist. I wouldn't paint, maybe I would read, I don't know what I would do. But aside from just being a hermit and hiding in the woods or whatever, I think I would have probably gone into like materials engineering in light of climate change.
Nice.
I think a lot of technologists that I talk to sort of struggle with trying to make technology that's better for the world while the world is burning, right? So a lot of people I talk to, I know I feel similarly, where you're sort of like, I'm going to leave all this and just work on climate change. That's not necessarily the best thing to do because that's not where your skills lie, right? So this is a conversation to have. But if I had followed a different path where I would be really happy with where I am now, it would probably be in materials engineering, specifically for developing materials that are robust to massive sways in temperature, humidity, flooding, all these things we're seeing now. Every time I see a materials engineering news article or talk, I'm just like, wow, this is the most fascinating. Tell me more about cement. I want to know more. So I could see a version of myself that really gets into that. Yeah.
That's amazing. So we've only got a few minutes left. So I would love to understand where you think we are headed. What is next for tech and so I'm trying not to say responsible AI because really I feel like we need to start saying responsible
AI.
Technology. Or just, exactly. Let's get rid of the responsible or let's just extend it.
Right, yeah.
Like, so what's next? What do you think the next challenge that you're going to be working on to fix? What do you think the next challenge is? What are we not seeing yet?
I don't know what we're not, well, I guess, yeah, it depends on who's the we here. One thing that is very niche right now that I personally am trying to make less niche, and I'm actually seeing movements in regulation that suggest this might become bigger, is around curating data. Oh, nice. So I mentioned measurement of data before. That's not a subfield, right? Evaluating models, that's like a subfield, or there are people with that specific role within tech companies. Measuring data, that's not a thing. I think that should to be a thing. And I think that now people in general are understanding that there's a relationship between the data that comes in and the output behaviors. And so we need a rigorous science of the data. We need to be able to define what we're looking for when we collect data. We need to be able to document the relationship between different inputs and outputs. So there's a technique called ablation, where you essentially like remove different parts and then see how behavior changes. I want ablation to become a big thing that people do when they're developing systems. So I am personally trying to move the world in this direction. I think that regulation is starting to get at this, sort of how important it is to have a science of data.
Yeah.
Rigorous analysis of data, rigorous understanding of data, and how it affects what models will do.
It's very interesting because as we are talking to customers, there are certain customers right now that don't have their data in the cloud. Right? They have their data on-prem, or they don't have their data is very siloed, and they want to already kind of take that leap to go into generative AI. And obviously we feel like we need to get our house in order, right? Before we go to that next step. We had a conversation with some CIOs and CTOs, and I said, tell me something very unsexy that everyone here needs to know about generative AI. And every single one of them said data, data. They said you have to have your data in place. You have to have governance around your data. You have to know where you're getting it from and measure. And I was very excited because of these buzzwords, and everyone wants to use it and everyone wants to change the world with it, but then we look and we go, oh, well, we don't even know where our data is. So that focus, that next level.
It's funny, right?
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, speaking about different life experiences showing you different things, like I feel like I've had this conversation with so many women where they're like, why aren't they paying attention to the data? But the culture is now all about the models. Right. Like, but the data, why is that not important? You know, it's so interesting that.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the first massive technology shift.
Yeah.
I've heard a couple of people say this over the course here. We've had two major shifts in our lifetimes, right? With the kind of the internet revolution and now the Gen AI revolution. And these are massive societal shifts, and we can't take them lightly. We need to truly understand the impact. But then when you peel back those layers, you have to have that foundation. It's like building a house on a pit of sand, right?
Yeah.
It's never going to work.
And you don't even know what the material is. Like, maybe it's putty. I don't know.
Exactly. So I would love to take a couple of minutes to just summarize kind of what I heard from you.
Okay.
So one of the things I would love for everyone here to take away is the importance of data that we just talked about. So hopefully you'll remember that one. The other one is when choosing your foundation models and the place where you're going to go for your generative AI is ask the questions. Right? We all have to be educated consumers, both in our personal lives and in our business. I know it doesn't sound like a lot of fun, but in the end, it's kind of like you can't ask for it in the end. Once you've given away everything, you can't ask for someone to treat you better or do something better with your data unless you kind of have that conversation on the front end. So I love what you said, ask the questions of all your vendors. Really, this is super important because in the end, it's your data that differentiates the model. Any model is going to work for you when you use your data on that model and you really put those things together. Anything else you want to make sure that, any of the closing thoughts that we want to make sure our audience walks away with?
Any closing thoughts? Well, I think it's important to know that there are a lot of people currently in a lot of sort of tech-oriented companies who are being marginalized. So if you worry about the pipeline problem, you can recognize that you're still in the pipeline. So like look around you. Are there people with marginalized characteristics that could be empowered further? Like say their name in meetings, right? Like make sure they're invited to the meeting, that they're on the email, right? So we're still in a pipeline. You can look at it that way. And so you can do your part within the pipeline to make sure that people who already tend to be subject to marginalization are treated as equals to everyone else.
I love that. Well, thank you,
Yeah,
Dr.
thank
Mitchell.
you.
This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you for joining us. My email is on the board. I did not, unfortunately, ask Dr. Mitchell if she would like her email on the board, but my email's on the board. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And finally, please complete the session survey on the mobile app and let us know how we did. Let us know if we can improve in any way. And thank you so much for your time. And Dr. Mitchell, thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your first reInvent.
Thank you. This was super fun.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.